So why don't we get started? Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Sawsville. I'm with Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife, and we're here tonight for a program to learn more about marten here in Vermont. With us tonight, we have Katy Crumley with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife to tell us a little bit about the marten reintroduction that happened and where we are with martens here in Vermont today. So Katy, I'm going to turn it over to you. What I do ask is that everyone keep their mics muted. If you have any questions, go ahead and open the chat box and type your questions in the chat box, and we'll relay those questions to Katy so she can answer those. And we look forward to having a great program tonight. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you, Lisa, for having me. I'm excited to present on marten. I've come to really love these little critters, and they are pretty cute, as you can see in this picture. So the presentation tonight, we'll go over a little bit just about marten in general, their life histories, and then we're going to go kind of on a historical perspective, talking about marten throughout time, and we'll end up towards the end in the present. So before I really get started, I want to touch briefly on the mission of Vermont Fish and Wildlife. It is the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And so this really directs all that we do, and we want to ensure that these fish and wildlife species are here for everyone to enjoy today and into the future. So a little bit about my background. I have worked with Vermont Fish and Wildlife for 5 seasons now, working mostly on American marten and lynx. And I wanted to highlight that through this presentation, we'll often talk about camera studies and our partners with U.S. Forest Service and others. But we do have some smaller partners like Cold Holiday Canada and Equinox Preservation Trust that have really allowed us to gather some data outside of the core areas we look at typically. And so these are valuable partnerships. And so I just wanted to highlight that now before we continue. Okay, so let's talk about what you'd be looking for if you wanted to identify a marten in the woods. So they are part of the Mustelidae family, which is the weasel family. You might also know some of their relatives like the fisher, mink, ermine. They're all related. They all have these long, slender bodies, a pointed nose and face. And for marten, they have these short, little legs and fairly prominent feet. And that actually helps them a lot in deep snow. It helps with what's called foot loading. It acts like a snowshoe for these animals. And so in deep, powdery snow, it allows them to walk on top for the most part. That's something that their cousin, the fisher, doesn't really have, and so the fisher will struggle in deeper snow compared to the marten, is going to have to do a little bit more bounding. You'll also notice that they have prominent ears, this long furry tail, and they are very good at climbing trees. So you are most likely actually to see them in trees when they're out in the wild, maybe even more so than on the ground. So they are going to weigh anywhere between 1 to 3 pounds. They're similar in size to a mink, but I would say a little bit larger. The males are going to be larger than females. We call that sexual dimorphism, meaning, again, that there's that difference in size. And this photo shows quite a brown coloration here on the torso. I find that can be a bit variable. But it is often darker than what we call the throat patch, which you can see between the chin and the front feet there. So that is almost always the throat patch going to be a tawny orange color. And it's very similar to a thumbprint, actually. So each marten has a specific pattern and spot pattern. And that actually allows us, if we place cameras correctly, to get a photo of that throat patch and ID individuals. We haven't done that exact camera work here in Vermont, but researchers over in New Hampshire have experimented with that. So that's a pretty cool feature that marten have, and it's one of the features that we are going to look at when we want to positively ID an animal, especially in the woods when they're running really quickly. If you just see a brown animal, try and see if you can get a glimpse of that throat patch. That is something that's really characteristic. You'll also notice that the head is more of a gray color. That is going to be fairly consistent among any marten that you'll find here in Vermont. And they also have an eye marking, helps them look inquisitive, I suppose, but that is also a characteristic feature. Okay, so a little bit about their reproductive history. These animals are going to breed anytime actually between now and early September, and they practice what is called delayed implantation. That means that the female is going to hold on to those embryos until sometime in late winter. Gestation is about 27 days, and the kits are going to be born late March to early April, so she may implant them in her uterus perhaps, let's see, I guess that'd be late February. Typically, she's going to have anywhere between 1 to 5 kits that she will raise by herself. The males do not help her with raising the young. I should note too, before I go on, so in this photo you can see kind of a little gray sphere on the throat of this marten. This is a radiotelemetry collar, and so just so you know what that is, but this is also a good example of that throat patch that we discussed, and you can see the different spotting patterns between this marten and the marten we looked at just a minute ago. Okay, so this is one of the cutest pictures, right? Some little kits. I really like this picture though because it highlights something that we're going to talk about in just a moment. So this habitat feature, this cavity in coarse woody debris or a downed tree, is very important for marten. They use it for denning sites. They'll use these downed trees. They will also use standing dead trees or standing trees that are alive but that have these cavities. So that feature on the landscape is really important for the ability of these animals to breed. So kits are going to be born very small, only about an ounce at birth, but they're going to grow very quickly. And so by 3 months, they are full size. And the mom is going to wean them about 42 days, and they'll be ready to start going out and exploring by about 50 days. And they're going to stay with their mom all the way through the first fall. At that point, they will go out and establish their own territories, and females will not mate until the next summer. So that's about 1.5 years after they're born that they are sexually mature. Food habits for these animals, they do depend a bit seasonally, but they are very broad and varied based on what the marten can find. They will eat things I think that most of us would assume, things like redback voles, mice, red squirrel, snowshoe hare, ruffed grouse, but they will also take advantage of a lot of soft and hard mast. Things like beech nuts or mountain ash berries are a really good option for them. I haven't noticed as many mountain ash here in Vermont, but in areas like the Adirondacks of New York, it's a very popular food source for them. In winter, they exhibit what's called subnivean hunting, which is actually really interesting and really to their advantage compared to their competitor. That simply means that they are going to be able to burrow under the snow, create a tunnel, and hunt things like redback voles underneath the snow. That is really possible because of their pointy face, long, slender body, and that's something that their competitor, like the fisher, is not going to do. So when we have deep, fluffy snowpack, it gives the marten the advantage. Something I like to think about when I think about subnivean hunting is if you had a really large log and you kind of picture a blanket of snow, you can imagine that there might be some air pockets on the side of that log, and that kind of helps me think about how they are going to tunnel and do some of this hunting. Okay, so distribution and home range. This map here on the bottom right is going to show the North American range, the American marten, anywhere from Alaska all the way to the Northeast. Along the Rockies there, that's actually a different subspecies called the Pacific marten, excuse me. And the home range for the American marten, which we have here in New England, is anywhere between 400 and 1,400 acres. Similar to their body size, their home range size also differs between males and females. The females are going to occupy the smaller end of that range. Males occupy a much larger home range. Females will defend their particular home range against other females in the area. Same with males, defending against other males. But it should be noted that males will occupy an area that may perhaps 2 or 3 female martens are in. So they're not going to hold the opposite sex kind of at bay there. Okay, so now we're going to dive a bit into habitat requirements. These are some great photos to start discussing what they are going to really key in on. The top photo I really like because it highlights the structure that's so important for these animals. We've already talked about cavities being really important, but they also like this really complex structure. It's really good hunting ground. It's good overhead cover. Not many species want to be, way out in the open. And so this allows them to just have that protection. It's also a boreal or northern forest species. So here in Vermont, you saw the map just a slide ago that we are at the southern extent of their range. And so in Vermont, they're really keen in on some of the higher elevation areas. Those areas often have the deeper snowpack. They also often have more contiguous forests. Think about the Green Mountain National Forest, these broad expanses of public land. You can also find them in the Northeast Kingdom, where there are, again, deeper snow, colder winters, and it favors them over the fisher or other competitors. Some folks also will like to say that they can only be found in coniferous forest. That's not really true. It's a forest with structure that they're going to favor, and a forest that has, things that they can feed upon. So you can find them in deciduous, coniferous, mixed, but that structure is really important. And before we move on, I do want to note that marten do not preclude forest management, but there are some specs, a lot of research actually that's been done in New Hampshire and Maine about what is needed to allow marten to persist. And often that's a degree of canopy cover for them, allowing them again to run through those treetops and hunt. And it's also leaving some of that coarse woody debris on the forest floor. Okay, so I think I've said it a lot, but I'm going to say it one more time. So snow depth is really, really important for these species. And as we start to think about challenges for conservation, we think about climate change because they do need this deep snow to be competitive. Again, that's for foraging, resting, subnivean hunting, and as I've mentioned already, competition with fisher. Okay, so that's kind of the life history and the nuts and bolts of the species itself, kind of from a broad overview. But now we're going to start our time travel, and we're going to go back to the fur trade. Granted, we could do a whole presentation on fur trade here in Vermont and New England, but I will touch on it and how it impacted marten. So back in the time of Native Americans, the forests were largely beech. There was some spruce and hemlock and maple, but the forest cover on the landscape was 90 to 95% forest cover. And as settlers came to this area, as explorers came, they realized the bounty of fur, not just marten, but other species like coyote and beaver that existed here. And in Europe, furs were power. Furs, were kind of your currency and your money. The more you had, the more respected and the more things you could purchase. And so when they found this unlimited resource, it was almost like a gold rush, right? And so by the mid-1670s, nearly 250,000 beaver alone had been shipped to London from the Connecticut River Valley. And so again, beaver aren't marten, but it illustrates to you that fur bearers were trapped without regulation. And to be fair to the natives that are depicted here, natives at that time were used to using stone tools, and when they saw the knives and hatchets, the steel tools that these explorers were bringing, furs were a way for them to get those tools and supplies that they needed. And so they would readily trap and trade for the goods that they needed. Again, as settlers came to the area, by 1760, we had about 3,000 settlers here in New England. You can see as they came that they also brought agriculture or increased agriculture to the area. By 1790, only 30 years later, 85,000 settlers, and 10 years later, wow, a big jump, 155,000 settlers. And so at the peak of this, we can see that a large swath of the landscape really changed from this complex forested landscape to agrarian. And so animals that weren't trapped, so fur-bearing species that weren't trapped as part of the fur trade, really declined because of a loss of habitat. At its peak, you may have heard of the sheep boom. Agriculture on the landscape was about 75%. So the tide really started to turn. And with that, we lost many of our iconic species here in Vermont. Among them was the American marten, but other things like deer, turkey, otter, mountain lion at that time, and wolf were also lost, among others. And so these quotes I'm going to read really illustrate that through the eyes of naturalists of their time. And so in 1794, there's a quote, and these are all talking about marten, I should note, that says large numbers in Vermont. So wow, we had a lot of marten here in Vermont. But by 1853, Zadock Thompson notes that this animal was formerly very plentiful in most parts of the state, but clearing and settling, as we talked about, of the country has very much reduced their numbers. And then we can see the precipitous decline by 1938. Frederick Osgood says, once common in higher spruce-covered mountain ridges, now nearly extinct. And so unfortunately, that was the reality for marten. But that's not the end of the story, gratefully. So a little bit more, but so in the 1900s, we see that detections, we could pinpoint individual detections. Before that, we would have expected to see marten throughout the state before the forest was turned to agriculture, but now only pinpoint locations. Unfortunately, all too often, we have to lose something to really find the value in it. And in the mid-1800s, throughout the nation, Fish and Wildlife departments were created to both protect and to wisely manage species like the marten. And so with this creation of Fish and Wildlife departments, there also came various pieces of legislation to help protect animals. Marten were afforded endangered species status here in Vermont, so they're not labeled endangered across the nation, but only here in the state. And that was in 1972. Along with that, we looked at ways to help marten recover for future generations and current generations to enjoy their presence on the landscape. And with that, Vermont Fish and Wildlife worked with the U.S. Forest Service to develop this recovery plan here, which included a reintroduction effort. And so now we're going to start talking about that particular effort. To begin, a habitat assessment was conducted statewide. They really looked at areas that had those key habitat characteristics that marten were going to look for: contiguous forests, areas that were not very frequented by the public, very complex forests. And so the Southern Green Mountain National Forest was highlighted as a really good location for reintroduction, as was the Northeast Kingdom. But they presumed at that time, and they ended up being correct, that the Northeast Kingdom would naturally be repopulated by marten from New Hampshire. And that again has proven true. So the reintroduction efforts that occurred between 1989 and 91 really focused on the Southern Green Mountain National Forest. And so I'll take a second here to orient you to this map. The red circles indicate the areas that were selected for the reintroduction. If you were to go to these areas, this is around Wallingford Pond or Wallingford, Vermont. This is Route 11 and 30, so Manchester, Vermont would be right here. And so this second reintroduction area is along Kelly Stand Road, and the town of Arlington would be right around here. To find animals to reintroduce, we had to contract with trappers in both New York and Maine who volunteered to live trap these animals. And we ended up with a total of 115 animals. You'll see that 88 males were brought to the state and 27 females. That is a skewed sex ratio, and that has to do just generally with the trap susceptibility of males. They tend to be a little more brave, have a little more bravado than the females. The females are more reserved and less likely to go to a trap. And so it was much easier for trappers to be able to live trap males. I believe the reintroduction effort aimed to bring 30 females to the state, but only 27 were able to be brought. And all of those females, I believe, were actually from Maine. So you'll see 11 individuals from New York and 104 from Maine. Okay, and so when the time came to actually put these animals into the southern greens, they used both slow and quick release methods. So a slow release is depicted here in these photos. It allows the animal to have a few days in the new location. The hope really is that they will be comfortable, be less likely to disperse very long distances. Hopefully, they will set up a home range in the area. And so that's what you see here. Obviously, these animals were cared for the time that they were held. You can see the spruce branches to keep the snow off and things like that. So after a few days, the animals would be released, allowing them hopefully to establish ranges. The quick release is just the opposite. You bring the animals in, obviously you're caring for them, and then when the time comes, you're just going to release them and kind of cross your fingers that they will stay in the area. So again, you should remember that these animals were split between the two reintroduction areas in the southern greens. So all of the animals that were released part of that effort had ear tags. It's a small metal tag that's placed in the ear to allow you to if you find the animal again, be able to trace it back to that release. 12 of the individuals also were fitted with radio collars, which we'll see in the next slide. After some time, you can see that animals were found dispersing quite long distances, the longest being an animal that was found 8 years later in Rangeley, Maine. So we know that they can disperse, very long distances, but that's actually in some ways, well, it is discouraging for this particular example, but it's encouraging for the future of marten in Vermont, because we know that they could disperse perhaps from New Hampshire back into the southern greens. Other animals were found in New Hampshire and Connecticut as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, 12 of the animals were collared. Only 9 of those were located post-release, and 4 were found to establish home ranges. You can see the radio collar here on this marten. This is actually the antenna, but there would be the collar around the neck. Those are fitted properly to allow the animal to be comfortable while wearing them. But they do have some challenges, and that is reflected in the ability to find them post-release. Sometimes, well, especially in the early 90s, the battery power wasn't always great, and the signal strength was, can be difficult to detect, especially when you think about the complexity of the forest. These animals like to use boulders, which cuts off signal, downed logs and things like that. And so that all plays into the challenge of being able to find them. Also, you have to think about trying to triangulate that signal that's coming from the collar. You need 3 points at least, GPS points, to allow you to really hone in on where the animal is. But the forest that they're occupying is notoriously difficult to get around the animal in a quick enough time to be able to properly triangulate. And so that reflects the number of animals that we were able to relocate. To supplement those efforts, cameras were put out after the reintroduction to try and better understand survival and home ranges. So in 1995, 40 remote cameras were placed. In the map here, the cameras were placed in these light purple areas. And again, these red circles are the reintroduction areas. In the 1995 camera surveys, 2 tagged marten were detected, and fisher were found at over half of the sites. We repeated that same study in 97 and 98, with 47 baited and lured cameras. We'll talk about it in a few slides, but to get these animals to come to a camera, we often use a skunk-based lure, which is skunk gland oil mixed with Vaseline. It works really well to bring them in from long distances. So when we talk about scent lure, that's what we mean. We may also use what's called Marten Magic, which actually has a minty kind of fruity smell. Marten have a sweet tooth, believe it or not, and so that is thought to kind of bring them as a little bit more of a short distance call lure into your set. Bait could be beaver, sardines, a variety of things. And so when that camera study was repeated in 97, 98, we didn't detect any marten. And it was at that time that we felt like the reintroduction had probably failed. And fisher populations seemed to be on the rise. We found fisher at 97% of the cameras, and so that was fairly discouraging. So that is reflected here in this quote: "Few, if any, survived to establish a viable population." And you can see the fisher coming for the bait here in this photo. This photo may be a little disorienting, so I'll try and explain it briefly. Cameras would be placed on the trees with the camera pointing down towards the ground, and this kind of cylinder housing the camera. Bait can then be attached in that cylinder or at the top, encouraging the animal to climb up the tree to get it. And that helps to control some of the incidental photos that you might get otherwise, perhaps of a coyote eating your bait too soon. And so that's why you're seeing that cylindrical look here in the photo. But not all is lost. And so now we start kind of the upward trend of marten in Vermont. So in 97, a marten was found in Barton. That was the same time that we were conducting those camera surveys in the southern greens. And it was thought that this animal was likely just one of the reintroduced animals moving north. But since that time, in 2005 and then 2010, we had additional detections. And so now we're going to zoom in on the southern greens again, and we will stay there pretty much for the rest of the discussion. So we can now see some points on the map of where we're actually finding some of these animals. So in 2002, 2005, we had several unconfirmed sightings, and then 2 confirmed marten in 2010. And we make that distinction between confirmed and unconfirmed because marten are notoriously difficult to identify in the woods. They're very fast, they're very agile. It can be very hard to get a clear view of that throat patch. And so if we're going to base some data on this really 1 or 2 sightings, we really want to be sure that we have it. And we don't want to not consider these unconfirmed sightings, but we really want to be sure we're making decisions that we have the best data possible. Unfortunately, the 2 marten found in 2010 were incidental takes in fisher traps. We'll talk about efforts we're making to reduce incidental takes towards the end of the presentation, but these were really good examples of marten, and we knew that we had some in the southern greens, and that was very exciting. And so with those confirmed sightings, we again deployed cameras in 2010. This here is a picture of Chris Bernier with one of those camera sets. So again, the camera will be placed here at the top, and you can see that the animal would have to climb up the tree to get its photo taken. Again, baited with beaver and skunk lure. And the camera locations are represented on this map in red, next to the incidental take location in green. So these were along Kelly Stand Road that runs between Arlington and Stratton, Vermont. And so a lot of the area, a lot of the forest in this area is very intact, and this is only a dirt road, which in winter is a snowmobile trail, so still very intact forest. So that was very encouraging to be able to find those sightings, and then those incidental take sightings were confirmed with additional marten photos. So marten were detected by these cameras in these 2 southern locations, while tracks were found just farther north. Fisher, however, were again detected all of our sites, so we have a pretty strong fisher population. And so those sightings really propelled us into some of the more modern camera studies and broad scale camera studies that we have started since 2015. And that is roughly when I started with the department. And so these are kind of landscape level camera studies. Vermont Fish and Wildlife partnered with the U.S. Forest Service as well as Central Connecticut State University. And we based the study largely on a project conducted in New York State in the Adirondack Mountains by Paul Jensen. So this study used 5 by 5 kilometer units. And in the next map, you'll see them represented as polygons. In those units, we randomly placed 6 game cameras, similar to the one here in this photo. And over those 2 years, we were able to get to 45 of these units. Each camera was in the field, or those units were in the field for about a month at a time. And the camera would be set, baited, and lured, and checked every 5 to 7 days for a total of a month. And it should be noted that we only did this work in winter. It's very hard to entice a marten into a camera in the summer. They have many other food options. And so this was pretty much winter only work, which is actually helpful when you try and avoid bringing bear and other things into those cameras. So these are maps of those units. I just want to orient you before I help you understand what the symbology means. So Bennington, well, to start with, this is the Vermont, Massachusetts state lines here. Bennington is right in this area. Manchester would be up here, and then routes 11 and 30. So Kelly Stand Road that we've talked about, again, would be cutting right through this area. And so each of these hashed polygons would contain 6 cameras, again, out for about a month. And we would take all of the photos that came from those cameras and input them into a database where we could sort the photos by species detected. And these 2 maps highlight where marten and fisher were found. You'll note that the marten were occupying these red highlighted polygons. And so that kind of formed what we called a minimum convex polygon, which really is just a very fancy term for saying this is where marten are in Vermont. It's centered around Glastonbury Wilderness, some pretty remote and good intact forest. Somerset Reservoir, for those of you who are familiar with the area, is just to the east of that occupied area. You'll also note again that fisher are in many areas. They were found in all of the units in those 2 years except one. This is down near Aiken Wilderness. So this was really our first opportunity to understand where marten are in the Southern Greens. And this has since been replicated with a similar camera study, but we have also undertaken a study supporting a researcher in New Hampshire who is looking particularly at lynx, but that data corroborated this. And so we feel fairly confident that we can say that marten are occupying this area. Here is one of the photos taken from those cameras. You can see that there are 2 marten here, which perhaps are siblings. And this photo, I believe, was taken near McIntyre Road, which would, I guess, be in the town of Sunderland, again, off of Kelly Stand. Okay, so at the same time that this camera work was going on, folks at UVM were also doing some genetic work to better understand the origins of the Southern Vermont population. Cody Alward was the graduate student on that study, and James Murdoch and Bill Kilpatrick, professors. And so this study, again, tried to understand the origins of this population. So these diagrams are going to help us understand their hypotheses. The red circles are their primary hypotheses, blue being the alternative. And so we can see on the left here that they suspected that marten in Southern Vermont were likely from New York and Maine, which makes sense based on the reintroduction. But their alternative was that they could have come from New Hampshire and dispersed south. For the Northeast Kingdom population, they suspected that perhaps the animals were likely from New Hampshire, which makes sense. But under other circumstances, perhaps it was from the reintroduced animals in the south moving north. To get at this data, they actually went to some fur auctions in Maine, perhaps other states, and collected hair samples. And then animals that were trapped in New York and several incidental takes, again, from fisher traps in Vermont, provided that genetic material. And when they analyzed it, they found that the population in the Northeast Kingdom was most closely related with New Hampshire, but they did have some genes present from the Southern Vermont population. Whereas the Southern Vermont population shared genes with Maine, but no detectable genes from New York. You may think that sounds a little odd, but if we think about the animals that were reintroduced, we have to remember that only 11 animals came from New York, and most of those were males. Actually, all of them were males, so that actually makes sense. The population really in Southern Vermont was largely from Maine. And they also found that genes were not shared with New Hampshire in the Southern Vermont population, and that there were genes in Southern Vermont that they did not detect anywhere else in New England. And that really was the component that sparked everyone's interest. What was proposed was that perhaps there were some animals, probably very few and undetected animals, that did reside in Southern Vermont even before the reintroduction and through the reintroduction. We have to be careful because it's a very small sample size, but it does provide, some ideas and a lot of fodder, I guess, for just trying to think about how that population survived. And so moving forward, it'd be great if we could get more genetic samples, but this is kind of the extent of their work, and it was a really interesting find for us. Okay, and so now I'm going to go to the most current study that is still actually ongoing. A lot of what I'm going to present is the theory of why we continued this study. The data is still being worked up, and so I'd be happy to, at the end, to answer more questions, but I did not present any maps because we're still crunching those numbers. So this study was, again, a camera-based study, very similar to the camera-based study that was done in 2015 through 2017 that generated those polygon maps. Again, we partnered with Central Connecticut State University and the U.S. Forest Service. And the principal investigators from Central Connecticut State was Paul Hateman, graduate students Sarah and Chris. But I should note that Kim Royer and Chris Bernier with Vermont Fish and Wildlife were also very integral to these projects. And so this version of the camera work, in 2015 through 2017, we put 6 cameras in every unit. This time around, we tried, well, every unit got sampled with 6 cameras, but we also came back and sampled with 4 cameras. And we did that because we're really trying to better understand detection rates between those different levels of effort. And we were hoping that if detection rates were comparable, that moving forward, we'd kind of have a slimmed down version, a more cost-effective and time-effective version to be able to sample these animals moving forward. And so we're going to kind of crunch those numbers and really try and understand those detection rates. Between the 2 years, we were able to complete 34 of these larger 6-camera units and 17 of the 4-camera units. You'll notice that it's a smaller subset of the 4-camera units. That's because we only sampled areas where we knew we had marten. And in conjunction with these camera methods, we also did some habitat variable work last summer. And so we're trying to correlate where we're seeing marten with the habitat components. And this, I think, too, was spurred on by a larger forest management project that the U.S. Forest Service is doing, and trying to bring them some data of where we're seeing these marten. And perhaps at some point, we'll repeat this study to be able to see how their forest management activities have impacted marten in the area. The habitat variables that we collected included canopy cover, again, important for them to have that structure, coarse woody debris, those down logs, and then tree species and the size of those trees. And these data points were collected at each camera. So someone went out to each camera location and took these specific variables. In the photo below, you'll see acute marten from this past season. And then a few more marten photos to share. Okay, so we'll take a brief look at some of the challenges as we move forward. So I mentioned previously that we are working on some exclusion devices to help make sure that marten are not getting caught in fisher traps. Trappers are very willing to help and participate in that, but unfortunately, their numbers are decreasing with time, and so they're just a really good resource in the landscape. They know these areas, and as we lose trappers, we lose some of that knowledge. We can only be in so many places at once, and so it's always good to talk with others and hear what they're seeing. But again, we are working on those exclusion devices. It's something that we can tackle to really help the marten in southern Vermont. But as we saw from all of our diagrams, we saw that fisher were very prevalent, and as climate change continues, we expect that a broader suite of competitors will be competing with marten, and so that's something that they're going to have to contend with, especially as we lose some of those really deep snowpacks in winter. Habitat degradation and fragmentation, I would add. There was a study done by Alexei Seren in New Hampshire, and he showed that as roads are created, they really allow predators like fox to access areas they may not have otherwise traveled to, and that poses a risk for marten. Not to mention too that marten are less likely to cross a road and disperse. And then finally, climate change. And I don't in any way want to end this presentation on a negative note, but I do want to encourage you that we all have a role to play in saving this species. We all can impact and do work that benefits this animal by helping combat things like climate change. So again, climate change is an issue because it is going to push marten, which are at the southern extent of their range, north and bring in other competitors. But we all can be helpful. Okay, and so now to end the presentation, I'm just going to show some pretty fun game camera photos. So this is a fisher. You can see the larger size here compared to the marten. A coyote. That's a bobcat. A beautiful bear, one of my favorite bear photos. You can see one of her yearlings in the background there. Some more of her yearlings later on. A marten right down here. And before I move on to, I just want to use this photo to show you the camera set. So we have the camera back here to the south, pointing north, with the bait, the sardine can on the tree that I had mentioned. Okay, a moose, deer, and that's all. So at this time, if there are questions, I'd be happy to walk you through those.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's so exciting that this endangered species is back. I remember when the introduction took place in '89, and then we thought it had failed. That was what announced. So it's so exciting that this is going on. Yeah, I know that Kim Royer and Chris Bernier, who have been at the department much longer than I have really enjoyed kind of seeing the success story. We know that perhaps with climate change, the species future isn't secure, but we're doing everything that we can to help propel them into the future. So, yeah. That's great. There are some questions about the initial study, and I don't know if you'll know the answers, but let's try anyway. Sure. Terry wants to know how you determined which ones were quick released and which ones were slow released. Ooh, I do not know that, and I don't even know. Yeah, I don't know that between males and females, how that was chosen. But,
Katie, I can just tell you that there was no method to that madness.
Okay, thank you.
We just randomly picked some for slow release and some for quick release. What we found was in the slow release cases, you had to snowmobile out every day. You can imagine Kelly Stand Road and feed them. And so eventually we didn't see much difference between the two. And so what we would do is pre-bait sites with beaver carcasses that had been donated by trappers, and then do a quick release. And so the marten would have a chance to they had a food supply in those quick release sites. So that was kind of our middle ground.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks a lot, Kim.
Sure.
That's Kim Royer from Vermont Fish and Wildlife who was answering that, who was a part of that release and that reintroduction at the time. And that sort of answers Ellen's question a little bit, if there was a difference in success between quick and slow release. And you found that there really wasn't, and so moved in that direction. So thank you for that. Let's see. Michael wants to know what site attributes are chosen for where the cameras are set.
Yeah, so for this particular study, it really was random. In some cases, we had to take accessibility into account just for logistics of getting to all 6 cameras in one day. But we tried to be random so that we were not influencing where the marten were. But in the link study that I did mention a little bit earlier, which again wasn't specifically for marten, but did provide some anecdotal data about marten, we were very specific in choosing areas that had more coniferous forest. So, yeah.
All right. When we're thinking about what marten eat and food, Joseph wants to know, will they consume wild apples that he has on his woodlot in southern Bennington County?
I've never really thought about wild apples because typically I'm thinking of them more on interior forests. I don't see why they wouldn't. They're gonna consume mountain ash. But I would say that if your apples are in the open, you're probably less likely to have them come in. If they're, you know, all kind of like covered and in the forest, perhaps. But just given where apples like, I probably suspect that they're not going to be willing to come into them.
Great. Joseph also asked about a question on use of artificial dens. He said there have been some studies in BC, Minnesota, Wisconsin that talked about fishers using them, and he didn't know if there was anything about marten. And my question to follow up is, if we have the habitat, do we really need that?
Yeah, so I have heard of those studies, and you know, in Vermont, we haven't really looked specifically at that factor, but I would say that the forest that these animals are using in southern Vermont, gosh, has a lot of structure. That doesn't seem to be a limiting factor. We have boulders and crevices and coarse woody debris. In those wilderness areas, it's everywhere. I think if it did seem in the future to be a limiting factor, perhaps that's something we could look into. But I don't think, you know, along the spine of the greens where they are now, that's a limiting factor.
So really habitat is what's key at this point.
Yeah, habitat and competitors, it seems like, are some of the key factors kind of holding them to the spine of the greens. But also climate, you know, as we move forward, when we have those winters where freeze, thaw, and we lose snowpack, it gets icy, it's really not great for marten. It kind of takes away that competitive advantage compared to fisher.
Great, interesting. Well, the rest of the comments are thank you, awesome, excellent presentation. Thank you so much. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. It was a great presentation. I learned a lot about marten here in Vermont and hope everyone else did as well. And we really hope that you'll all join us for our other presentations. We have one on Friday about old growth forests and wildlife. We have another one coming up on wild turkey, and we really enjoy being able to bring you these programs to help inform you about Vermont's great state, habitat, wildlife, and all those great things. And we hope you have a wonderful night and stay cool. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you, Lisa.